Hello and welcome to Dance 4's A Conversation Place number 9. I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Lucy Suggate and Maria Witek, who are going to talk about various things in their practice and what they're researching at the moment. So very quickly, I'm going to hand you over to those.
Yeah, thanks very much. I guess I can say a few words about myself. I'm Maria Witek. I'm a post-doctoral researcher at the Music in the Brain Center in Aarhus in Denmark, and we work on psychological processes, the cognitive science of music. We do some neuroimaging and brain research, but also behavioral experiments. And my research in particular has been focused on the relationship between rhythmic complexity and the desire to move to music, to dance, and pleasure. So I've been researching this concept called groove, which is basically this musical quality which is sort of associated with the desire to want to move and synchronize with the rhythm of music in a pleasurable way. So, and I've used a number of different kinds of methodologies to look at that. So just rating surveys, just asking people how they respond to certain types of rhythms. I've done some neuroimaging research, so looking at what happens in the brain, and also some motion capture, so measuring how people synchronize to different kinds of rhythms with different levels of complexity. And yeah, that's about it.
Okay, so maybe I'll start now then. I'll introduce myself. So I'm Lucy Suggate, and I'm, I suppose, considered a dance artist. And for the last few years, my research has taken me to look at the kind of enduring relationship between dance and music and the transformative qualities of both. It's mainly practice-based, so this curiosity has risen from doing. So it's I do, and then I notice, I reflect, and I question, and I observe myself in a practice. And then I've just recently undertaken some research looking at trance and dance, and especially sort of focusing around altered states of consciousness that arise through the use of music and movement. So that's kind of really where I am, and I suppose the music I'm accessing at the moment is a kind of contemporary genre of electronic music. That's kind of been where the focus has been at the moment, although I am also moving to looking at classical music and yeah, kind of looking at people's, I suppose, people's iPods and the kind of music that they select that helps them move and enhance their state. I think one of the principles that I've been looking at is moving towards the ecstatic. So reintroducing dance as a kind of, or reconnecting back to the reasons of why we dance in the first place. So the kind of primal, so when the kind of contemporary and the primal sort of meet, what occurs there, what kind of movement can you produce in that moment? So that's where I am.
Cool. Well, it definitely sounds like we have things in common.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely.
So the concept of trance that you were mentioning and the ecstatic state, are you thinking that as a sort of a physical thing, or more of a sort of kind of a transcending aspect? Do you see that as something that is very much grounded in the body, or is it something that transcends the body and sort of brings you into a sort of extra body space?
I think it's kind of integrated. Well, the way I experience is it's something that's integrated. In that when I do something, whether that's, I've noticed that, you know, I can do quite repetitive movements, and they start to alter my understanding of consciousness, or and that can be how I read the space, how I sense my own body, how I respond to my thoughts and impulses in that moment. So it kind of happens from an action or activity of doing. But I do have this almost dropping down moment where, you know, there's a shift, something changes. So the possibilities will open up, and I suppose you would say that, and I use it as a kind of, there's a perceptual change. So my understanding of my own perception starts to expand and become quite fluid. So, for example, I think that I will be able to do things that are actually quite physically impossible. So my thought process becomes quite open, lucid, optimistic. You know, the potential of something to happen is really present, and then I'll also start to sense it. I mean, even talking about it, I can start to feel my skin tingle, and the rush that you get when you're experiencing that opening or that altering of states. So I think it starts, and I think I notice it interchanging often because I'm dealing with time and duration as well. So often I'll, you know, through exhaustion, I'll have to bring it back down, or I'll land somewhere quite realistic, but then I'll find it again. So there's these notions of flow and flow, like,
yeah,
kind of reaching the optimum sensations. And I've noticed that music, or particular types of music, I suppose, can quicken or allow me to access those states, those highly tuned states that we're all kind of really enjoy feeling a lot faster.
yeah. Yeah, this notion of flow is something that definitely has been sort of theorized quite a lot in music psychology research, mostly with music performers. So the idea that you can sort of, through performance, reach this kind of optimal state in which you lose a sense of, some people describe it as losing a sense of agency, while other people say that it's a kind of a complicated topic, because it's very difficult to study, because if you're in that state, then as soon as you want to reflect on that state, you have to sort of exit the state, and especially this idea of like repetitive structures enhancing this kind of experience is something that has been addressed for sure. And some people call it, in a sense, as being in a zone or in a groove. So there's something about the rhythmic properties, not necessarily, but at least certainly in many cases, something about the rhythmic properties of music that make that kind of state possible. There's very little done on the sort of actual what's happening in the brain at the time of these kind of states, because they're very difficult to sort of simulate or sort of create in a lab setting where you're trying to, you know, get someone to have these very, very high intense experiences and at the same time study them in a very controlled way. But there seems to be something, at least, that we can say about the kind of music that sort of facilitates this kind of response. And with rhythm, it seems to be that a kind of perfect harmony or a perfect balance between predictability and complexity is something that seems to be quite effective in this kind of sort of heightened experience. You can call it groove or flow or ecstasy or whatever you want to call it. So a kind of a rhythm that has some predictability to it, but not so much that it becomes too repetitive or too too simple. So something to sort of continuously stimulate you in a sort of circular way seems to be quite effective in eliciting these kinds of states.
Yeah, because I've sort of I'm kind of interested in what you said about complexity. I sort of because I noticed this idea of anticipation, like the body gets into a state of anticipating, so it's great to be able to anticipate, and you can drop into a particular loop of movement when you anticipate, but there is something inspiring around when complexity is thrown in, and also something about the infectious nature, particularly of beat and rhythms. And I just sort of wondered if you'd come across that in any of your research, like why are we as human, why are our bodies attracted to this, you know, why are we infected, why does it become, not only as an individual I'm infected, but then there seems to be this kind of potential for kind of collective effervescence or collective, you know, collective swarm sort of behavior.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So there's currently one of the sort of main theories of rhythm perception in the field is a theory of entrainment, which basically is modeled on the idea of oscillations. So you can kind of imagine yourself as your attentional processes inside you are constantly oscillating, and they have a sort of temporal description with a phase and a period. And so you think about your sort of attention as an oscillation. And then you have oscillations in the music. So a music has a phase and a period, or at least the rhythm has a phase and a period. And the idea is that when these two come in contact through sound waves through the air, one becomes driven by the other. So our attentional processes become coupled with the oscillations in the music, and our attention, our anticipations, our expectations become completely driven to these the patterns in the music. And one of the ideas is that this even happens when you have complex rhythms, because we can precisely anticipate. So after, there's experiments showing that after a really, really short period of time, we can sort of deduce the metric qualities of rhythms. So even if you have a very syncopated rhythm, or one that has a lot of offbeats, which can be, you know, if you look at it on the surface, is something that can be hard for perhaps a very simple computer to sort of decompose, because it doesn't have beats on all the downbeats, but it actually has them on the offbeats. And that's something that we can do very, very easily. We can sort of understand the underlying hierarchical properties of rhythm very, very quickly. And yeah, the idea is that we have this sort of oscillator inside us, to put it very simply, that is being driven by the oscillator in the music. And our expectations become coupled with this oscillator. And I find that myself a very persuasive way of thinking about it, particularly because that's meant to be flexible. It's a dynamic system, so it's a sort of reciprocal. It sort of emerges as a reciprocal relationship between the two.
So so it could also work it could work the other way, in the sense that if it's a live musician, so I entrain my brain waves to the music, but actually the musician could somehow syncopate with my movement to alter the rhythm, so that it's a kind of feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly, because we obviously come with our expectations as well, and we can hear rhythms in a particular way, which can alter our perception of them. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that you can actually physically change the music. The music is a sort of separate external thing, but the perception of it is affected by us as well. So if you have, for example, rhythms that have these kind of like we call them microtemporal deviations. So that means that it's not quantified, so it's not necessarily straight on the beat, but maybe a little bit early or a little late or something like that, to cause, some people call them kind of wobbly grooves, or yeah, non-quantized grooves. They sort of, because they don't have a strict, so if you think about that as an oscillator, they don't have a strict phase. They actually sort of change in phase through the repetitions. That can create a kind of interesting sort of attentional process in us, in which the perception of the beat becomes sort of more fluid and changes depending on, or a sort of more open definition of where the beat is. And that can be affected by our personal sort of what we're exposed to, if we're used to listening to these kind of rhythms as a sort of straight thing, or whether we're more used to listening to these more fluid, open kind of beats. So yeah, so there's also different kinds of entrainment. So you have self-entrainment is another one as well, where you're just entraining to your own sort of internal oscillator. So if you're dancing without music, for example, and you're creating your own rhythm. And then you have social entrainment, where, you know, people, two musicians or two dancers could be entraining to each other, mutually coupling. So that's another situation in which you have a sort of reciprocal relationship, and where the beat is sort of negotiated between two people or more.
I think some of the research that I'm about to embark on is working with a musician called James Holden, who works with brainwave frequency and pink noise and human timing when he's constructing his music. Makes various software patches that process. And what we're interested in is, so you have a layer of sound that has an impact on those who are witnessing, but how will my movement, so that it's almost like a two-prong attack to sort of maybe allow those who are witnessing to enter into other states of consciousness. So we're kind of looking into how movement and music can, I suppose, optimize a kind of collective altering state of consciousness. And I wonder if you had any thoughts or research that's been done around that.
Well, I mean, I know for sure that the sort of audio-motor coupling in the brain is a really, really strong connection. And when we watch people move, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the brain actually simulates the movement in our brains. So some people talk about mirror neurons, which is a sort of contentious topic, but there's definitely something to be said about sort of neural stimulations. So that doesn't even necessarily have to be when you're watching someone. Even just listening to rhythms seem to stimulate motor areas in the brain. But for sure, when you have a sort of a visual representation of those movements and an auditory one, that connection is very, very strong. And you see there's a number of neuroimaging studies looking at recordings of participants watching dance performances, and it's so the areas of the brain that are actually involved in making these kind of movements actually become active when you're simply watching them. And another interesting thing is that they see that this seems to be affected by learning. So if you take an amateur dancer and scan their brains at the beginning of a session, and then you train them in a specific kind of dance style, like could be anything, and then over time you will see that when they watch these performances of the dance style, the more they learn to actually make these movements themselves, the more these areas will be active when you're simply watching them. So in sort of in the context of your work in a performance, having that combined, or very sort of carefully combined motor expression and the auditory expression can be a really powerful thing for sure. And yeah, it's really interesting to think about how you can creatively optimize that link.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's definitely where we're going, or want to go anyway.
Okay.
Oh, what a fascinating conversation! I was really gripped by that. Recently I've seen some of Lucy's work, and actually having very similar kind of memories in my body about when thinking about it. It's quite fascinating. Anyway, that's for another day.
Yeah.
So, I'd just like to take this time to thank you both for taking part in the conversation today. That's for big thank you, and maybe we can find a time to do something similar in the future, maybe around one of Lucy's works that she's got coming up in the UK. That would be a really good time to do it. So thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.